Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan. Today I'm going to talk to you about red lines in diplomacy. Before that, subscribe to Conversations, like the video, press the bell icon. And after you finish watching this show, please share it with everybody that you know. Today, I'm going to talk to you about three instances of coercive diplomacy that have taken place this week in world politics. By coercive diplomacy is a form of interaction between two countries in which one country is leveling threats against another. The threats can be economic ones in terms of threat to impose certain sanctions if the country does not do X, Y, Z. The other way could threaten action in terms of force, use of force, or there can be a simple diplomatic threat, a threat of breaking diplomatic relations. So coercive diplomacy is where one country is engaging with another country, but there's an element of coercion or threat involved in the interaction. So there are three instances this week where we have seen this example of coercive diplomacy. One example is with the United States talking about red lines with India. So identifying a red line is a form of coercion to suggest to another nation, to another ally or even a partner that, look, these are the limits of what we are willing to accept from you. But if you cross this line, if you cross this line, this red line, then it will mean that we are not going to be friends anymore. So there are three instances, as I said, this week. One is when the US ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, talked about a red line with regards to India's behavior and India's interaction with US citizens, India's attempt to assassinate US citizens on US soil. I will talk to you about it in more detail later, and also Dr. Jaishankar's response to Eric Garcetti, the US ambassador to India. The second coercive diplomacy instance happened when Joe Biden had a phone call with Xi Jinping in which China drew a red line and essentially threatened dire consequences if the US allowed Taiwan or pushed Taiwan to cross that red line. And we will talk about that in a moment. And the third red line was today when Joe Biden called his buddy Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and essentially drew a red line with regards to human rights and the targeting of aid workers and the brutal manner in which Israel has been killing civilians by the thousands. I mean, the amount of human rights violations and international humanitarian law violations that Israel has committed are enormous, and the United States finally is trying to draw a line, or at least pretending to draw a red line in the sand and talking of consequences. And we will talk about that. So to begin with the US-China case, tomorrow or today, yes, the US Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, went to Beijing, and she has a 4-day trip. And then a week or two after that, once again, US Secretary of State Blinken will be visiting China. So in the past 6-7 months, you could argue that this is the second time these two secretaries, cabinet secretaries of President Biden, will be visiting China. So as you can see that in the last 6 months or so, there has been a lot of high-level diplomatic and shall we say, head of state contact between China and the US. Biden and Xi met in November in San Francisco. There is talk of further interactions in the near future, but this was the first phone call, a 2-hour phone call that Biden and Xi had since their meeting in November. For those who are watching from India, you might note that during this period, there has been no high-level contact between India and the US. There has been no interaction between Biden and Prime Minister Modi. And yes, Dr. Jaishankar did interact with Secretary Blinken, but that was at the Munich conference, and they were together on a panel. but neither has visited the other in the past 6-7 months. So it's interesting to observe that there seems to be a slight shift in diplomacy between US diplomacy towards India and US diplomacy towards China. But in the phone call, the discussions were not all hunky dory. The United States did appreciate China's cooperation on issues of fentanyl production, on drugs, but the US also talked about China's role in supporting Russia and undermining European security, whereas Xi Jinping on that phone call very clearly told Biden that Taiwan was a red line for China. And this is where he said that he will not back off if the current, the new head of state in Taiwan, if after inauguration in May, announces some kind of independence or not. So the current head of state, the person who just got elected, is a very pro-independence person, and so China is reluctant to accept them. So there is fears that China might do a lot more coercive things towards Taiwan than it has in the past. So Biden was basically conveying to China not to do that. China was also very upset with the high level, the banning of exports of high quality and advanced technology and chips to China, and Xi Jinping tried to say that this is an interference with China's development, and China has a legitimate right to develop, and the US is preventing China from developing. So the discussion was interesting. They did talk about serious issues, but neither side pulled back, as it is apparent. What you're seeing here is the readout from the State Department. And in the State Department, there are right now, Janet Yellen is going to China to basically discuss 2 or 3 things. She wants to talk about fraud. She wants to talk about narco investments or the finance, the secret and dirty money that goes into financing of narcotics. I guess they are seeking the cooperation of China in dealing with it. But more importantly, the biggest thing that Janet Yellen is worried about is the overcapacity in manufacturing that China is pushing for. What China has done is borrow lots of money, subsidize manufacturing of factories. And right now, China's factories are operating at 50% capacity, but they have more capacity than the rest of the world in many things, including, say, legacy chips. So what China is doing is manufacturing goods at a very low price. And because there is overcapacity in China, the companies in China are operating at very thin margin. And therefore, the products are even cheaper. And so they are being, in many ways, far more competitive than any other manufacturer in the world. And so manufacturing in Europe, manufacturing in the US, and other parts of the world is suffering. And there's all this talk of retaliating against China by imposing tariffs if China continues to subsidize its manufacturing. It will be interesting to see how the West reacts to India, because in some ways India is also subsidizing its manufacturing at home by giving many concessions to companies, including state level investments. But we will see when, if at all, if there is any issue. That will probably happen only when India starts producing at a much larger scale than it is at the moment. So this is the main issue that Yellen is dealing with in China, China's overcapacity in manufacturing and the state subsidy in that. The second red line is the red line. So the first red line was China telling the US that Taiwan is a red line. The second red line is Joe Biden finally telling Bibi Netanyahu and that, and this is, I'm going to read it verbatim so that you can see, say that President Biden emphasized that the strike on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation are unacceptable. The White House said in a statement after the call, he made clear that US policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. I mean, if you're listening to John Kirby, the national security spokesperson, Israel has done nothing wrong ever so far, according to the State Department's assessment. So this threat actually is quite meaningless. Biden also said Israel needed to announce and implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. I don't know why they did not demand that Israel allow more aid in. And if that doesn't happen, then then the aid that the U.S. is providing to Israel, the military, and the billions of dollars of military aid that the U.S. provides to Israel will depend on these steps that Israel takes. This is something that Antony Blinken also repeated and reiterated while he was in Brussels today. If we don't see changes that we need to see, there will be changes in our own policy. So actually, Blinken's statement is far more clearer that there are going to be consequences if there are no changes in Israel's policy. Well, we want to see outcomes. Israel can say whatever it likes, but it's continuing to kill civilians, killing aid workers, targeting them. The way the world, those aid workers from different parts of the world who were working together, the way they were killed was just horrific. And if you remember, I spoke about it in my previous conversation. I don't want to go over it again. The third red line is when Eric Garcetti, speaking to ANI, said this. He said that any country having an active member of their government involved in a second country trying to assassinate one of their citizens, that, I think, is usually a red line for any country. There's a basic issue of sovereignty. It's a basic issue of rights. So basically, he said that these accusations that Indian intelligence officers were involved in an attempted assassination of Panno, who India claims is a terrorist, and the US says is simply their citizen. And in that interview, actually, Eric Garcetti goes to great length to defend the policy of freedom of speech, and said we believe in freedom of speech and we don't want to go down this slippery slope. Really, we are trying to destroy the careers of students at Harvard University just because they have a slogan about Palestine. They are also threatening, they are trying to undermine the Harvard University itself to protect Israel. So when Eric Garcetti was talking about the freedom of speech in the United States, I'm surprised that people listening there didn't laugh at him on his face. There are limits to freedom of speech in the US, especially with regards to Israel. And if those privileges are available to Israel, then the same should be available for India. India should demand that and point out this hypocrisy and inconsistency in the US policy. Jaishankar's response, even though many Indian media outlets celebrated it as if it was something fabulous, was actually just factual. He said that the U.S. ambassador, as an ambassador, will say what he thinks is the position of his government. And the position of my government is that in this particular case, there has been certain information provided to us, which we are investigating. And so basically, he said that the US has provided some information to India, and India is investigating that. And when the investigation is over, they will have something to say about it. Until then, they have nothing to say. So that's all it is. It was interesting to say that he did not challenge or push back at this idea that there is a red line that India cannot cross with regards to the United States. Add to that the report in The Guardian today, which talks about allegations and based on interviews with both Indian as well as Pakistani intelligence officers, that India may have been involved in the assassination of more than 20 or 20 alleged terrorists who were seeking some kind of, who were hiding in Pakistan, basically. So I think this red line business will not be over soon, and it needs to be seen as to how quickly the two countries can resolve and put it behind. But right now, the red line remains right there, and we will see what happens. I think the next step would be when India finishes its investigation and then shares that information either with the US, and then one of the two countries makes it public, or at least we are told that the matter is settled. So I hope you found this interesting and thoughtful. So please subscribe to Conversation, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share it with your friends and your social political network.